walking up there all the time and, you know, to have that.
All right, I'd like to call the meeting to order. July 19th, we're going to be discussing the draft design manual chapters. We have some administrative business to do. We have some minutes to approve on January 8th. I hope you've had a chance to read them. If anybody has changes or recommendations, I'd be listening to them now.
Mr. Chair, I move we approve the minutes of the June 8th meeting.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. So we're ready to review the draft design manual and chapters. We talked a little bit about this, and I think, I don't know what the process is for us to do this, but it seems like we could quickly dissolve into some bit of dysfunction unless we put a little structure and order in it. So what we'd really like to do is go through each chapter and have first questions on specific questions about that information. And then once we get through those questions, then we could have some general discussion about it. And then we'll just progress through so we can make sure that we get all the questions answered first and then be able to have some discussion about what people think about it. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
So I'm just going to give you some of the dates and context of what we're doing, how this process has been going. So about a year ago, we did an evaluation of Central Issaquah, and architectural character and certain urban design issues were raised as concerns coming out of our first 3 years. The council approved a moratorium on September 6th, including architectural fit and urban design as 2 of the 6 work plan items. Staff proactively combined them into 1. Consultant team was hired in March. That was Crandall Arambula. And we've had 3 meetings with the Development Commission on that. The April 5th and May 3rd meetings were with Crandall Arambula with an initial assessment and introduction, and then a presentation of the design manual components. And on June 8th, we discussed the outline and styles and images about the styles. So our schedule for going through this draft design manual with the commission is chapters 1 and 2 tonight, chapter 3 next week, and then the following week is parking lot issues, or if you go really fast, you get a free night.
Incentive, huh?
So, so I think similar to what you're describing, we want to make sure we talk about global things and then we can go through page by page. I really do want to emphasize that we would like edits, grammar, typos, punctuation, wordsmithing, not to do that tonight. To either give me a written, if you have marked up your written copy, that's fine, or if you want to email it. But I think if we talk at that level, we will be here till next year. And then this is the schedule in case you're interested. Next week is a council work session. We just got, a few minutes ago, I saw in my email that the chapter 3 has arrived. So you'll get that electronically tomorrow, and then it'll be mailed out. So I assume you'll get it on Friday or Saturday. The council is going to get the same chapters that you've gotten for their work session next week, where Crandall Arambula will be talking about the structure of the document, the approach, sort of catching them up with where they are. The last time the council had a presentation was that introduction and initial assessment. So unless they've been watching your meetings, they haven't had a chance to hear about that. After we finish our meetings with you, we will be working with Crandall Arambula on the preparation of the final draft design manual. Goes to PPC, Land and Shore, and then council adoption is proposed for mid-October. I was just speaking with some of the commissioners. We are thinking that towards the end of this process, or possibly at the PPC hearing, either PPC would come to your final meeting, or some of you might go to the PPC hearing, just to provide that bridge. We know that they've always found it they've really appreciated understanding the kinds of observations and effort that you guys have, explaining why you've recommended what you've recommended. So we can talk about that as we go. I think these first two meetings, we will just focus on getting through the text, and then we can talk about what might be helpful with that third meeting. So that's the end of our introduction. I have, just so you know, we have a Word version of the document, so if I need to be typing in actual things the way we sometimes do here with motions, we can actually be typing in text, or we can pull it up to follow along on screen, whatever you guys find useful. So following your recommendation, Chapter 1, if you have questions, I will do my best to answer them.
Yeah.
Commissioner, I do have a question on page 1, in the paragraph that says visual examples. It refers to the Design Commission.
Randy or Mike?
Oh, sorry. On page 1, in the paragraph headed Visual Examples, it says they are intended to provide designers, developers, and the Design Commission a means.
Yeah, we'll fix it.
Is that's not
We have
new?
no new commission planned.
That would be us, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
We're
right,
renaming you.
Other questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Lucy, on the PPC, are they having a continuous meeting on this document? Are they reviewing, or are we doing the bulk of it?
You're doing the bulk of it.
Really? Okay.
Well, their job is to, is more of sort of procedural piece. But the reason that we've involved the Development Commission is because of your knowledge and your experience actually reviewing permits. And PPC would not be in a position to do that. So PPC is a required part of the process, and I don't want to diminish their effort.
Sure.
But I think the bulk of the reason we've involved you so much is that we think really you guys are the experts and provide a good testing board for what kind of tool you think is necessary.
So in the
You said the
meeting with the
nicest.
PPC, is it an update to them on what we have done so far on the document then? That's end of next month. It's a public hearing. When is
So-
the meeting with PPC?
So Ray, my recommendation is until we get through this, I don't know that how best to coordinate between the two. So I think as we get to the end of the second meeting next week, we probably will be in a better position to talk about how best to transition between the two commissions. Would that work?
Yeah.
Because as I said to some of the other commissioners, we're kind of making this up as we go along. This is a unique process and a tool that the city hasn't developed before. And so I think we're kind of feeling our way through it. And I understand your questions. I just don't have answers at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Question. So, and you just mentioned that it's a new tool that's being created, and so I'm looking at page 17 of 75 in our packet. I don't know if you've got the same numbers. And as I was reading through this, the role of the design manual section here, trying to understand the relationship between this and the codes and the standards that are applied. Because if you go down to, it says the guidelines in this manual are prescriptive and not discretionary. So generally in code world, prescriptive means it's a fairly black and white application. This is what you do. And the way that this is drafted is very discretionary in nature. It's more of a design guidelines as it's kind of written. And so I was a little bit confused. And then I went down to the paragraph below that, and it says, in cases where the guidelines prescribed in the document contradict previously adopted regulations in the Central Issaquah Architectural and Design Manual, the design manual takes precedent. So it says this takes precedent over the code. And so I started to go, okay, that gets a little challenging, I think, from a design and just even from an enforcement standpoint. So I'm trying to figure out how these layer from just an application standpoint. So you're talking about the tool and kind of massaging that might be something we want to think about.
So one thing I didn't mention is we sent them on these two chapters, probably 11 pages of comments.
Okay.
Okay? So that was number one from all four reviewers. We understand that the prescriptive versus guideline question is likewise with us. They have made, I'll be frank, it's been really busy, and I haven't gone through to see which of our things that we commented on they've already folded in and which ones will come with that final draft. This is clearly one of them because we have exactly the same questions. Less about this taking precedent over central Issaquah standards because I think our plan is that next year we thought we would do it simultaneously. Everything's moving too fast. We need to get this settled into being the tool that we believe it should be. Then next year we would go back and I think look at central Issaquah and figure out what parts of, for instance, Chapter 14 on buildings would need to be removed because this has taken that place. But certainly the prescriptive piece and how to apply this was a big question of ours.
Good, thanks.
Can I follow up on that question? I also marked that with a big question mark. I guess I would ask Commissioner Brennan to say again what your concern is, because I think my concern was the same, but I'm not sure. So rather than going on.
It's trying to figure out what's the construct of the regulations that will be applied in Central Issaquah planning area, in the hierarchy of how they work together, so that there's not confusion about that and what takes precedence, and where the staff has and the design professionals have some room to create versus this is what the code says and this is what you need to do, like setbacks. Sorry, folks, that's what they are. You don't get to mess with those.
Right.
But when it comes to architectural features and things like that that are included here, you want to have a little bit of room to create. So that was, I think, my point. And it sounds like staff is already thinking through that.
Well, and to, I'm going to just, this is the first piece that I heard you say, which is what staff focused on. So I'm going to say this just to make sure that we're in concurrence or if we have different perspectives. The central Issaquah standards versus this document is a question for us. That's one that we feel that we can resolve in the future by revising the standards. I think our bigger question, which I believed you touched on, Commissioner Brennan, is that this is stated to be prescriptive, but a lot of the language is not very prescriptive. Right. It's, it's a steep roof, but it's not saying steep is greater than X slope, or there are a lot of shoulds and there are very few shalls and must. So what does it mean to be prescriptive? Is that as a performance standard? It says prescriptive. Prescriptive standards are typically like, it shall be 7, and then it's 7. A performance standard is, it will be pedestrian friendly, and pedestrian friendly means it does X, Y, and Z. And so the way this is written right now is a little bit more of a performance standard, but it says it's prescriptive. So we have some of those same questions about how they're intending to apply this document, so that we make sure that the language achieves the intent.
Yeah.
Because right now, it doesn't seem very prescriptive.
Yeah, and I wrote that term performance standard in here too. I mean, that's the way it feels to me. So you've got, again, that room there's some room to create. And it isn't prescriptive. There are only a few places, and I flagged those too and said, well, really, do we want to be that black and white here or not? So, but most
Well,
of it's written
and
like
I think that
performance.
would be a good thing to hear from the commission, is that the notion between prescriptive and performance, and your thoughts about that relative, I mean, you've only seen the architecture piece so far, but your thoughts about it relative to architecture, because I think their intent is it be prescriptive based on the conversations we've heard, both just with staff and mostly with the commission. So understanding your thoughts about that would certainly be very helpful.
Lucy, I just want to maybe go back to the base.
Sure.
When you say they, you're talking about the consultant?
Yes.
Okay. That's number one. Secondly, my understanding of the reason that we're doing this is because Issaquah looked at the first 3 years of the CIP and said, okay, we need to look at it again. And one of the things that I believe was said in the first meeting with the consultant, with the Development Commission, was that the extant document regarding development in the central Issaquah plan was too nebulous, that it gave developers too many options, and it gave the city, and specifically the Development Commission, not enough ability to say that's not in keeping with what the vision was for the central Issaquah plan. So the answer to that, as I understand it, is to give us a more prescriptive approach to saying, then a developer can come in, or an applicant come in and say, okay, I understand what my options are if I build here in this district or in this district. And to be pretty clear about the fact that we're trying to get away from having to approve something because it's compliant with the code, but it's not really representative of Issaquah or Northwest, whatever it is. So is that where, would you agree with that, or if not, then?
No, mostly I would agree. So I would say that intentionally, the Central Issaquah standards were written to focus on urban design and not architecture style, not materials, and not colors. I mean, there were some things in there, but very few tools. There was clearly frustration in the community, council, commission, and so the determination was we need a tool that addresses that. And someone to come in and help us identify what would be the right styles, the right colors, materials, et cetera. So that part I completely agree with. I think that the, and I'm hoping Mike will chime in, given his background, and others as well. I'm interested in their perspective from the tools they use. We want to identify those things that are important and values of the community, and be able to be clear and get those things. And yet, architecture isn't usually a formula. It is a design. Each site and use is different. And so how do we communicate that without creating a formula that gives, and I think this was what Commissioner Brennan may have been touching on, is where there is some ability to respond to these things that are unique, while clearly communicating the expectations and the things that are important to us. So the challenge with a prescriptive code, an absolutely prescriptive code, is there's no wiggle room. There's no, and that may be, and I am not saying we should not do that. I think we're just trying to understand the pros and the cons. And if we want to try a very prescriptive code, we could absolutely do that.
Well, Lucy, perhaps part of our discussion in this chapter could be, after the questions, could be our discussion of whether we think it should be prescriptive versus performance standards.
Absolutely.
That work? That way.
So how about other questions?
I had one on urban core. In the last meeting, I think we discussed the use of the traditional Issaquah styles in urban core. And we had three options that we were discussing at that time, not to allow traditional styles at all in urban core. And this is primarily in Chapter 2, but it's referred to beginning in Chapter 1. And not to use them at all was one option, and to have them on the borderline, permit them inside the urban core zone was another option, and to allow traditional urban Issaquah styles across the urban core was the third option. And I think most of us discussed number 2 and 3, favored those, maybe with a slight emphasis on 3. But I noticed that this document, beginning in the first chapter, really does restrict urban core to one style, and that's Northwest Contemporary. So my question was, did we want to rethink our discussion regarding using traditional styles inside the urban core in the light of this draft of the document?
So the thing that I would add is that we did discuss this with Crandall Arambula, and they did not have a concern with that. So I think, I don't know whether they did not have time to incorporate it, but it's, I don't think any of us have a concern with it, and they were going to propose a method for doing it. And so maybe the question to come back to them is that we would like to know that during this review process, what method they propose.
Okay, so it's not specifically a Chapter 1 question. When we get into Chapter 2, there will probably be more about this, but I, for one, am willing to rethink my vote on that after I've seen how they developed the urban core styles. You know, I'm not necessarily sure that I could see a arts and crafts style next to a Northwest Contemporary. So we'll table that for right now.
Other questions?
About specific aspects of the document?
Yes,
that-
Chapter 1.
Chapter 1.
Just Chapter 1.
Okay.
Just one more. We did receive a comment late today, I believe, from Mary Lynch, and one of the questions was regarding definitions. She threw a list of definitions, and we don't just throw definitions of something in here that's not used as a term in the document, but if there are things that are useful from just this list that she submitted, there are terms that are used in the document that would be helpful to have them defined if they're not already defined. That might be a worthwhile exercise just to go through and see if we missed anything.
Right. There are a couple of things about definitions that I would add. There are some definitions in the Crandall Arambula document that are also in Central Issaquah's definition chapter. We asked them to remove those. I think their inclination was to make it a more user-friendly document to just match the definition. The challenge with that, of course, is remembering that it's in 2 places if you update the definition. You know, we need to work through that. We also staff had identified a long list of definitions we wanted added because there are a lot of terms in here that aren't defined in other city documents. And they added a significant amount, but I'm not sure they had time to incorporate all of them. And I completely agree that looking at Mary Lynch's definitions makes complete sense. If there are good definitions in there that address some of the things that we've identified, I think that's great.
And if there are definitions elsewhere in the city's code that would be applicable here, but they're not restated here, making a note that, you know, please refer to, you know, chapter blah, Issaquah code.
Yep, that's a great idea.
Notice in the glossary section, there are a few that are out of order. So I don't know if you want to take them here or as typos. We can do that easily later.
Typos, please.
Suggestions for terms to include?
Sure.
Okay. Want to consider SIP since CIDDS is included? Mullion and Munton. I have no idea what they are, so. Our architects can help with this, I'm sure.
I know.
Got one for us. I want to see the month.
Thanksgiving last year.
Okay, other questions? All right. I think that on the table is the real discussion of how prescriptive we want this to be. What's the sense of the commission on on their, whether they see it as being, as the contractor once said, whether they were aspirational or prescriptive. What is the general sense of the commission? How prescriptive do you want them?
Related question, the document does say currently that if there's a discrepancy between this and plans and ordinances, including, I guess, municipal code, that this document is going to rule.
Right, but that's already been discussed, right? That the city staff pointed that out. Is that correct? Did I miss that?
Right, no, I mean, that is
That's
the
the
way the
intent.
document's written.
I'll just answer your question that I think it needs to be tighter. I think, wait. It doesn't need to be tighter than it is, but I think that it is absolutely in the right direction and it will result in us being able to do a better job, both in the long run, in the general sense, and in our own walking out of the room after we have to consider an application. So I very much appreciate the theory and the direction of what we're seeing so far.
Do you think it should be prescriptive?
Yes. To me, that's why we're having this discussion. That's why the moratorium was put in place, so we could say, wait a minute, let's look at what have we learned from the first 3 years, and what do we need to do as a result of that? So
I remember the consultant specifically talking about how our default position usually was, well, it's in the code, even though it wasn't necessarily anything that we'd thought about. We get a bright blue building in the middle of town, and as opposed to being prescriptive and saying, here's what we want, So I think, and clearly he was of the mind that it should be very prescriptive.
And this is absolutely anecdotal, but when I've been talking a great deal about this process with folks, I have yet to encounter anybody that says, no, why are you doing that? That's a waste of time. Everything I've heard in public barbecue feedback has been, whoa, cool, that's good. I didn't know you guys were doing that. You guys being the city.
Is part of the idea that if a developer complies with the criteria that are defined here, that proposal will probably be almost automatic, whereas proposals that don't comply are subject to much more scrutiny, public hearing, documentation, justification, and so on?
I think what it means is before somebody comes in with a proposal, they look at what the expectations are, and they don't propose anything that's really radically different than what is recommended. So that would eliminate frustration on their part, because they wouldn't design something really fancy that didn't fit at all, and it would eliminate some problems with us of not having an idea what was going to come and seeing something that we were probably going to be pretty comfortable with.
I would agree with that, yeah. Because, that would save the designer a lot of heartaches, coming in with a submittal. What is it that you're looking for? They submit something, and the city folks review it. Yeah, it's within, on the code, it doesn't say they can't do it, so your hands are tied, and then when it comes to the design commission, our hands are tied too. So we ended up with a blue building that everybody's complaining about.
Yeah.
How did that get through? And so, yeah, I think this really clarifies that. So if we can make it more stringent, maybe not in agreement with Commissioner Harrison, but make it a document that people can pick up and say, okay, this is what the city of Issaquah wants, I will design it based on that, and then we know it'll go.
So if I can add 2 cents. So I think, maybe the question's a little bit different, commissioners, because I think everybody up here would say this is mandatory, you have to comply with this. The question is how exact is this written? So right now, and I think this kind of goes to what Commissioner Brennan was saying earlier, is how much latitude are you going to give each designer or each architect to kind of fit within the box? How small is the box? And so right now, what they've drafted up is I think they're intending it to be mandatory, but they're kind of bookending it to some extent. You know, here's kind of some examples of recommendations. Here's some things that are not recommended. And if it's clear enough, and that's, I think, one of the biggest questions for you guys is, have they painted a bright enough picture for you guys to say, okay, now I know it goes here or it doesn't go there, and that there's enough breadcrumbs for me to get to the goal line, or there's not. And if there's not, then we need to tell them they need to unpack it more, right? And so that's part of the conversation I think we need to have. If you guys are comfortable with the philosophy that this will be mandatory, it's a rule, you have to comply with it, but it's not going to say your buildings have to be orange, right? It's going to say it can be like this, but it shouldn't be like that. And is that enough direction for us, or do we need to populate it more? I think that's the biggest question.
Yeah.
And
And that's a good point, Kevin, and I would agree with you, but that would give the city staff and the commission more negotiating tools. If that's the requirements and the architect comes in and they do not fit that requirements, then that's a tool that they can use to negotiate on something else.
So, so part of, and Lucy gave an example earlier on you know, steep pitched roofs, right? Okay, so I don't want to be negotiating with an applicant on whether or not a 12-to-1 is a steep pitched roof, right? I mean, it should, if they're going to,
flat.
if they're going to use terms or adjectives like steep and wide and low, I think what Lucy and I are hoping for is that they give us a little bit more of what they're envisioning of what that means, so that we don't have to sit here amongst ourselves and say, well, is 4 feet wide? Well, it depends what it is, apparently, maybe, you know? And so some of it is, I think, just providing a little bit more of that quantitative piece to some of the descriptors that they've kind of queued up.
so.
And
so
they have, and I just want to point out that they have begun to do that.
Yeah, the roofs
I was
pitch,
about to say,
there's a
the roof
formula
one,
in there
they-
that I
they-
thought was like, well, that's pretty specific. On page, shoot, it's in the first chapter.
Yeah, it's
Where
in
it
the
define,
it's
in
in
the
the
definitions,
definition.
in definitions, roof pitch, and it gives a definition of
Right,
low
it says
pitch.
what low, medium,
Yeah,
and-
moderate and steep.
Right, so that's an evolution based on some of those comments, I think, that we dished back to them after the first round, which was, hey, you guys got to give us a little bit more to work with, right?
And Kevin, I think what we don't want is to have mandatory cookie cutter approach. So I don't think anybody has any desire to have a document that ultimately comes out of this that results in literally a cookie cut, doesn't leave any room for an AAS, it doesn't leave any room for a little bit of an imagination or whatever. That's not what we want. But that's why, so far, I really appreciate the shape of this, because I think it does get us in the direction that we've been talking about. And if it has in the definitions, if it gives specific things like that, that take the confusion about what is wide and what is steep and things like that, that comes out of in the final product, that's good.
I
Yes.
think one of the examples I found on page 52 of the document, under Northwest Contemporary Style for scale appropriate, it said, if taller than 4 to 5 floors. I thought, well, does it mean if it's taller than 4, or is it taller than 5? It kind of has to be one or the other, it seems like, so, to be prescriptive. I think in the last meeting, I felt more inclined, I think, to have this be a very prescriptive code, to come up with very specific, but in reading through this, I got concerned about the prescriptive nature, and I started thinking about some of the buildings we have in Issaquah and which buildings would and would not comply with this. Like, let's say the library downtown, could that actually fit in one of these styles? Or some of the other buildings. And like bright colors are not allowed anywhere. deemed inappropriate in all the different styles?
I actually think Urban Grange allows it as an accent.
Just as an accent?
Yes.
Yeah, but not as a
Yeah.
full color, and it's so it, I guess I started thinking, wait a minute, are we gonna have a very monotone
Right.
central Issaquah area with,
Well-
if we're that prescriptive about color?
Right, so just to take a step back to your first point, Commissioner Morgan, we did ask them if they could add some Issaquah images that they think are compliant, and we began to suggest some buildings for them to look at. And also to include some contemporary examples, because a lot of the Issaquah traditionals, now, again, I'm saying this because I want to know if you agree, because direction isn't helpful if our direction is heading someplace different. But I don't think that we were asking, my impression is that we were not hoping to have Leavenworth or, things that look like they were built 100 years ago. I don't think we're opposed to that if that's what someone chooses, but I think what we were asking is for some, and they have some, but a few more modern examples that comply with these various Issaquah style, the different styles under Issaquah, because a lot of them were very historical, and again, we were not trying to create a historic district. It was our impression.
Yeah, comment about, and I agree with you, I guess the situation that we're in, we don't want to have a cookie-cut description of this is how the building should be, but at least we have something, a minimum. Low pitch roof, 1 to 12, anything above that is okay. That's a minimum. Anything above that, we encourage the architect to come in with ideas. On the vivid color, I had a thing about it. Vivid color is inappropriate, I agree, unless it's an accent color. So maybe we could say something along that line. We don't want an orange or purple color building, but we could use that as an accent color. So something along that line. And if the architect chooses to use that, or designer, then that's okay.
Maybe especially for the Northwest Contemporary, where it says vivid is inappropriate, but maybe we could say except in accent colors.
Yeah, yeah, and if you could look at, that's where we're drawing it, page 59 of 75. The green color, it's inappropriate. But then the picture above it, white, well, what is more vivid, green or white? So, you have to be somewhat, you don't want vivid color, and I would agree with you. And everybody says, well, what is vivid color to you may not be vivid color to me. So there seems to me that we need to set some minimum standard that we will accept, and then anything above that, we'll leave it up to the designer to have some latitude for them to do their work.
So I'll tell you a little anecdote, which is that the city, whenever you go to a planning law class, the city of Issaquah is always, staff are asked to identify themselves, because we're one of the few communities in Washington in which we were taken to the Supreme Court and lost. And I don't mean state Supreme Court, I mean U.S. Supreme Court. So it is it's really important to us that it be clear and meet legal tests.
Right.
And one of the important things is pictures. That's why I'm riffing on your comment, Commissioner Leong, because pictures, when you're using words like muted and vivid and accent and natural, the pictures are going to be essential unless we're creating a painting palette, and we have one in Old Town and have found that really cumbersome. So I think we would like to not do it that way. At the same time, we have to provide enough clarity to the words that we use, and pictures is a common way to do that. So I think that if white is too vivid, then, or if we don't, even though it is bright, it's not vivid, then we need to, think about how those things work so that we're clear with everyone and we're in a good legal standing.
And there's also got back to, I guess, that phrase, just inappropriate versus appropriate, and versus, I guess, if it's truly prescriptive, would it be allowed and not allowed?
Or required and,
Required
and not
not.
allowed or something,
Right,
yeah.
yeah.
So just a couple comments on the question here. So one of the goals here obviously is to create additional, like you described them, Lucy, tools, and Keith, on how we can guide development to accomplish the outcomes that are important to the community, but not be so constraining that, we end up with everything looks the same, because you don't want that, and obviously, because that's not a rich and kind of appealing environment to create. So part of the question in my mind, going back and forth between the question of prescriptive and kind of very black and white application versus something that's a little more performance-based, is normally the prescriptive requirements are included in the code. They're going to set the dimensions, they're going to set the building envelope size, they're going to set the maximum floor plates, FAR, and all that sort of stuff. So they're going to set that. They're going to say you can't have visible mechanical equipment on the roof. So they're going to be very clear in the code in a lot of areas. There's still some discretion in some areas, but this tool is really about trying to define the characteristics of development outside of just the overall kind of size and density that's covered in other places. It's what's it going to look like. And so I think for me, looking at this as a performance standard, it's about here's what we want it to look like. These are the examples. And when there are very specific areas where we want to give very clear direction about a form or colors or whatever it might be, we need to choose those and be clear about that. But this cuts both ways because, one, hopefully it gives some clarity to the development community and design professionals, but when it comes to us, it also gives us a tool to push back on this. And, okay, you might think you made it, but we don't think you did. So, and here's why. And so we've got some tools to say, we want to shape it a little differently than where you guys took it. And we're more attuned maybe to the community than they may be, because they may be coming from a different place, even a different part of the country, doing design here. And so it's trying to give clear direction there, but I think about it, it's not only a tool for them, it's the tool that we're going to use to say, it's not quite where we want it to be. And we didn't have those previously. It was, somebody made the comment earlier, it met the code. And we said, well, yeah, you're right, it met the code. So we couldn't push back. Well, this is I think, going to be a really important piece of that process for us when we see things that are really going off the mark and we want to push back on them. So again, I don't know if I'm being clear, but there are some things I think we do need to be pretty clear on. The standards of the style selections and things like that and where they go is something that's been defined here pretty clearly in what areas of the city, and there's some discussion about maybe we want to talk about that. But the other elements of the buildings that we feel are important in the way they look, et cetera, I think is really what we need to focus on. And did they hit the mark, and are we in the right balance place here between being really clear on those things versus let's let some creativity happen?
If we're uncomfortable about the colors and the degree to which they're specified here, a long time ago, I think we raised the issue of a palette, primary colors and accent colors. Why did that not work for Old Town? Is it just too few, or is there an idea of Pantone ranges? I know Palo Alto has a palette, right? You can look on their website and you can see 60 colors they specify for their, at least, civic buildings and public buildings. So would a Pantone range work? I know nothing about Pantone, so maybe somebody else could.
You know the name, I mean, that's impressive.
But I'm thinking about, in corporate settings, when you're on brand or you're off brand, and that's usually a very specified palette of primary and accent colors. And so I'm curious why that could not work in our case if it were broad enough and if designers were involved to try to define that.
I think we have a significant amount of discretion on the selection of colors. I think the code does that. I think maybe this is a little too broad, and maybe there's some more specificity we can give regarding accent colors, that are appropriate to provide additional definition on key building elements or something like that. But when it talks about, find one that says color here. it talks about colors that are appropriate for kind of the surrounding area. Sure. A palette that's complementary to Issaquah's natural environment and hillsides and creeks. I mean, that's a pretty broad statement.
Very broad.
But the idea is that it's going to blend, it's going to look good against the backdrop. You're not going to have something that's just like this bright beacon in the middle of the city.
Which page are you on?
Sorry, I am on page 52.
Is that the page number 52 or the packet 52?
Packet 50, it's page 52 of 75 in the packet. It's the Northwest Lodge style. And I think there's similar language in some of the others, if I remember right. So the question of what we're trying to say is that we don't want to have a building that's some bold, bright color sitting in the middle of what is a lot of buildings that are more muted and blending with the environment around them. But you would want to have a building that does something that maybe has an element that pops out for a reason, an architectural purpose that looks good and it's a nice accent and it creates interest. So you don't want to say no to that. So how do we put language in this? In the design standard
That's right, I
that
think,
does
I mean, bold, vivid colors are only allowed, I think, as an accent in the Grange style. It's the only place I saw it through the whole document, which, yeah, I mean, I just get very concerned, we'll end up with a very monotone palette of buildings. And again, I'm not voting for Atlas Blue either, it's.
Well,
Well, it suggests sky, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well, and I think I think you raise a good point. We don't want it to be monotone. I also have some questions about natural. I mean, I think we can think of flowers that come in every color of the rainbow. And so I don't know whether a Pantone range is the right thing, but I think something that helps visually or numerically communicate that. I think so I'm not asking for the commission to solve this problem. We can work with the consultant. But I do think that the point that you're discussing is an important one to give clarity is are brighter colors as an accent or on a certain element or on doors appropriate or not appropriate, all styles, some styles, that I think is a great piece of feedback to get from the commission. Then we'll need to figure out, how do we do that with your
Maybe that
guidance.
statement just does it, something like inappropriate except conservatively as accents.
I think the consultant and the city can figure out how to do that, but the general sense of the group is that we're real interested in having it as prescriptive as we can. At the same time, we don't want it to be so prescriptive that it's cookie cutter, and one of the issues that pops up is color. And so working with them and trying to figure out how to be able to articulate that in a way that doesn't open the door for anything, but at the same time recognizes the concern of the commission, and I'm sure the city, of having that, having a style that's consistent with the colors of the city.
Along the same lines, when I got to page 44 of 75, there was a section in there, and this is on architecture, so are we out
Okay.
of chapter 1 yet?
We're not out of chapter 1
Okay,
yet.
I'll hold it then. It's a general thing, and on that, without going to a specific paragraph, I got to the point on that where I thought it was too restrictive. The section in question, I circled it and said, is this giving the applicant enough choices? Because I think that's a line that we want to be prescriptive, not restrictive. And prescriptive is more, gives the applicant more options, but very clear options. And so I think that's where we want to go.
So how do people feel about the input on the introduction? We've got a few more sections to go. And I don't want to cut off the discussion. At the same time, it's starting to sound a little bit familiar.
Yeah.
So does the staff have adequate feedback from the commission?
On chapter 1, absolutely.
Yes. So I would recommend, unless there are any other philosophical thoughts on chapter 1, that we move into chapter 2.
Oh, just a quick one.
Okay.
Interested in people's opinion on the placement of the checklist in the front instead of in the back as an appendix, for example, I guess, which is where I would expect to see something like that.
What page are you on the checklist?
Well, that's page 20 of 75.
20 of 75.
No, actually, I think, I kind of like it in a way, in that it's right up front, so if somebody, like an architect picks this up to go through it, they'll know right away.
Right,
Here's
we
the
can't
grading
miss it,
sheet.
and even though a lot of this hasn't been defined yet, they get
Right.
the sense of what's coming, so just wanted to ask that. I forget where it was placed
Question.
before. It
No,
surprised
you're
me that
right,
it
it
was in the
was at
front.
the end.
Yeah.
I noticed it too, when I was flipping through, and I had the same reaction to, not a bad idea to push it forward to catch your attention that you're going to be
Yeah,
using this tool when you go through it.
I agree.
So, I think we can move ahead to chapter 2, architecture. Questions first?
Question, I read, I wasn't on the last meeting, but I read that there's a lot of concern about where the line is drawn between urban core and traditional Issaquah. And my comment is
Well,
that.
this is just questions right now. Right.
Well,
Right, okay, I'll
so,
reframe it.
but if, Alex Trebek will take it in the form of a question. We forgot, I think the consultant listened to the tape, but we forgot to call that out as one of the edits. So that actually, when we sent the next set of questions, that was one of ours as well. Was that an oversight that the map didn't get changed? Or was that an intentional thought on their part that it should not be changed? And we just haven't had a chance to follow up on that.
Okay, then the question then is that, would Gilman Boulevard be included in the traditional Issaquah?
Parts of it would.
Part of it.
So as far as my memory from checking this is that if you look at the screen, the area where the hand is the area that does not match the urban core zone. And so that area, if urban core style only applies to urban core zone, then this area would be removed.
Okay, and that raises a related question that I had. Last time I had discomfort with the use of the word district here, because district has a very specific meaning, right, inside the SIP. And it's high visibility, district visions and so on, and the word district was being used here to refer to architectural styles. There's been some massage of the language, I appreciate, to try to clarify that, but I think there's still a confusion about that in my mind when it's talking about a district in terms of architecture, not the zoning districts of the Central Issaquah Plan. So I don't know if that's a question, but I have a proposal essentially to change district to zone. And I know there's a confusion with zoning then, but I think we could talk through that as well.
I don't quite understand your concern.
Okay, these are referred to in the manual now as architectural districts, correct? And an architectural district then would comprise, say, multiple SIP districts as they're defined in the Central Issaquah Plan. For example, if I look at urban core here, it may span a couple of CIP districts. So I was just trying to avoid that ambiguity in the term, the use of the word district there, so that we don't have to qualify it every time and say it's an architectural district versus a SIP district. I think the solution's in the first sentence where it says the architectural districts are zones. That might be
Prefer
the
to
way
call
out.
them architectural zones.
That's my proposal.
So I would actually be a little concerned about that for the very reason that you identified,
right.
because we have zoning districts. My impression is that the districts that are in the central Issaquah plan are being renamed to something different. So that may actually free up district for use here. But I appreciate what you're saying is that we want to have clear nomenclature so that it is easy to know when we use a term what it is applying to.
Because I think it raises the natural question, oh, if I'm in the urban core zoning district, and does this style automatically apply? What's the relation of those?
So this is the problem of having too many moving pieces at once, right? So I would suggest maybe putting that comment, because I think it's a valid one, in the parking lot for now. I think the districts are turning into neighborhoods because I think it makes more sense. It feels better. And then if that does happen, then an architectural district that spans multiple neighborhoods makes perfect sense, right?
Absolutely.
So we've got to figure out some of those pieces, and I think we'll get there. I think it's just a matter of, so far, nobody's pushed back on that comment. On the district side of things, calling them neighborhoods instead of districts. But that conversation's midstream. So I'd say we put that comment maybe over here on the sideboard for now.
Good comment, though. Good point.
So I have a question. Page 33 of 75 is a good page for the example. There's dimensional requirements that are called out in here, or limits. And what was coming to my mind is, are these addressed in the, elsewhere in the code? Do we have limitations like this? And then, are there areas where these styles architectural styles, or whatever we're going to call these, are allowed, that would allow either greater or lesser? I mean, where these dimensions, see, it creates confusion. So if you say you can't be more than 5 stories, this one, but you're in a zone that allows a taller than 5-story building, you could, so now you all of a sudden said, well, you can't have a building because you're only allowed this style of architecture in that neighborhood or zone or district, whatever I'm calling it. Now we created a new constraint that is more restrictive than what the code does.
I guess what I would say is, I think what that means is you can't use arts and crafts if you're going taller than 5 stories.
So I think that I don't know, this is something that we created, so I don't know, and that's why it has a big draft across it,
Oh, in
because
the back,
I think they
yeah.
just dropped that in. But part of the reason that we created this is we needed to understand some of those questions that you were asking, from color, from length, from height, trying to understand if we had eliminated things that we didn't want to eliminate. So I think the point, for instance, is if you're going to have a 6-story building, then you're Northwest Lodge, because that's really the only style in, the Issaquah district or whatever it's called, that allows that height. So I think what Keith is saying is true, that it's, as you get to the edges of certain ones, either, length of building, height of building, a style is going to be almost selected for you, as opposed to having the full range and getting to pick.
Right. And that was my thinking, and I'm glad I didn't study this table, but that was my concern. It was like, are we forcing something here inadvertently, as far as specific style, or limiting building height that would otherwise be allowed in parts of in the Central Issaquah Code? Yeah. Okay, good. So it just sounds like you've got a tool that you're working through that.
A lot of the wood frame over base that we see, is that typically a 5/1?
Yes.
The
5/1
newer
or
apartment
5/2.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So any of those then that are outside the urban core would have to be Northwest Lodge.
At that height, yeah.
Yeah.
How do you like it?
Yeah, so we need to think about that, actually. What does that do?
Welcome to Mount Rainier.
Right. Because then we want to think about point about other styles, because creating a new constraint on the development potential of a property. So, I mean, Northwest Lodge doesn't fit for a lot of uses that developers would want to.
Well, you know, based on, I haven't looked at this in a little while, but, you know, you have lots that go up to 4 stories. And, you know, I think we're seeing 4s and 5s. So the question, and, you know, Northwest Lodge takes you to 6. So the question is, are any of these other do we want another style that goes to 5?
And Northwest Contemporary permits higher heights, right? But right now, we're saying that's not to be used in traditional.
Right?
And I didn't look at the zoning maximum heights and number of stories, but outside of the central, you can't, the urban core, you can go 4 or 5 stories
Well,
in some areas.
so
With
without,
the density bonus.
yes, that's
Right.
exactly.
So then you're stuck with Northwest Lodge style architecture.
Well, you're pretty much limited to either 48 or 54 feet, depending, if you can go to 54, if you have either under building parking or ground floor retail or a lobby. But otherwise, you're limited to 48. So you're probably at 4 stories.
Yeah, that would mostly cap it
Right
at
now,
4.
without going above the base. So I think that the range that they're talking about is not unreasonable, but there is a height question.
Yeah, and I know you start tipping the architecture if you get too high, it just doesn't fit. Got it, so, okay, well, it's a question you want to go with them with.
Other questions?
Yes.
Good, let's hear them.
Sure. On page 44 of 75, what's the rationale for the roof? Roof material shall not be a dominant characteristic of the building. The roof, you know, when you have a roof, sometimes you want the roof to stand out. So are we limiting the guy on the roof and roof material?
I think in that particular architecture, the answer is that's their suggestion. So if you pick arts and crafts,
Uh-huh.
they're saying the roof should not be a dominant part of the architecture.
The craftsman.
Was that craftsman? Oh, thank you.
Craftsman style.
Craftsman, sorry,
Craftsman style, you can't.
craftsman style.
Okay, so you go to a different style.
So you could go to a different style if you wanted, say, a significant roof element.
Okay, okay.
So-
Thank you.
Actually, this is what I was referring to earlier. So same page, inappropriate. Again, it has wood,
Shingle.
no, yeah. It seems to me that it might be limiting when it says no wood shingles or shakes on a craftsman style.
Or
Is that-
standing seam or slate, so it leaves you with composite shingles. I mean, I'm kind of being, I mean, but yeah, I mean, these are the conversations
Well,
we need to be having.
Yeah, I actually
right?
had circled that. I mean, because I like the prescriptive part, but this is where, to me, when I was reading through this, I thought, wait a minute, what is wrong with giving them the option of using shingles or shakes in a craftsman style?
Or
I mean,
metal.
Specifically saying it's inappropriate.
Yeah, I would say all of the above are appropriate, you know, in the inappropriate category.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with saying inappropriate, bright, vivid, so on and so forth for craftsmen. But then you get down there to the roof material, I'm thinking, you know, maintenance is an issue for a developer. And I thought that was a little bit too restrictive.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the asphalt industry would love it. But we're limiting ourselves to just asphalt.
Do you know why, make it a question, what the specific complaint or concern is about,
Well, we actually asked some questions about shingles and shakes because there was not consistency throughout the document in terms of, we just didn't understand, sometimes shakes were allowed, sometimes
yeah,
wood shingles
exactly.
were allowed, sometimes neither were allowed. And we had a question just to understand that better, but, I mean, not as specific as, we didn't specifically call out this page, but just to better understand how they were thinking those.
did you get an answer? Is
Not
that
yet.
one of- Okay. Thank you.
Perhaps it's the pitch of the roof, maybe? That it's too steep and you can't use wood shingle because you can't get up there for maintenance. That's why they kind of ruled that out.
If they're flat, you can't use them, but if they're steep, you can.
Is
Right.
it,
It's pretty steep, the way.
Well, but
pictures show.
actually, I'm using my cheat sheet from the back. But it's a low, Craftsman, they've identified a low pitch roof. So that I think that's a very good call, that you would not want a true wood product on a low pitch roof.
okay. All right. Thank you.
So let's focus on questions. Good job. More questions?
Page 37 of 75. Again, inappropriate standing seam, this is also for arts and crafts style. Standing seam or metal roofing. Again, yeah, that's it. You know, when I looked at the picture there, I underscored it and looked at the picture and I thought, what's exactly wrong with that metal roof? It's not a bright color, it's another one of the things I don't quite understand why it's inappropriate.
Well, you know, and maybe, I mean, we're focusing a lot on roofs.
Yeah.
And so, you know, more variety or less distinctions between roofs might be fine. I think that they may be trying to help make distinct looks.
Yeah.
And if we allow all kinds of roofing everywhere, and I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying, but I think they're just trying to create a little brighter edges between which kinds of materials can be used where, both color or material.
And I don't know what standing, so
That is
standing
a
seam, is
standing
that what
seam
that
roof,
is? Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
More questions?
I'm thinking of the way that Northwest Contemporary has been defined here now with lots of images and a real range of applications, residential to retail and office and so on. And just brainstorming, I wonder if it would be appropriate to allow this sort of style outside of urban core. I'm thinking of Western Gateway, for example, east side of Gilman. I wonder if it would get us out of the issue of having to build a Northwest Lodge anytime you need a 5-story building in the Gateway, Western Gateway.
That was, talked a little bit about that already. It's about exploring are we creating too many limitations on, given all of the, looking at all of the parameters that they can build to. So outside, as far as your question was one we talked about, is if it only allows for, if it allows for a 54 or 60-foot building height, maximum height, I don't know what the top was, you can do a 5-story building there. And now, based on this criteria, the only type of building you can build is that. Is that what we want? And I would suggest probably not. But I don't know what, how many opportunities there are actually to build a building that size, given the properties that are available for development or redevelopment. So I don't know. They need to take a closer look at that.
Well, and I think applying urban core outside of the urban core, Northwest Contemporary outside the urban core, may not be the only solution. I mean, I think if we have a concern related to the architectural styles that are available for the potential heights, I think that's something to throw back in their court and say, can we reconsider some of these other styles being taller? Is there a different style that, or a certain treatment that upper floor needs that's unique if you're going to have Grange or Western Falls Front or arts and crafts with 5 or 6 floors? I mean, I think we don't have to solve the problems. I think we have to pose the concerns, the questions, and then ask for some help, unless we, feel very passionately about or have a lot of clarity about what the solution, what appropriate solution there is.
I have one question. I feel like in my first pass of this, I came up with this term, but I can't seem to come up with it again, is I don't see any place for departures addressed anywhere. And, that's one of the mechanisms I think we have for wiggle room, right? I think it's the discretion of this board and commission and departures. And I feel like we discussed it, and is it in here and I just missed it, or did I make that up?
I think you made it up.
Okay. Well, that was
So
very
we
inventive of
have,
me.
but, I think what you may be thinking back to is, with Vail, they brought several elevations. The commission identified which one. We identified where that didn't comply with certain codes, and had written an administrative adjustment of standards. Now, that's an odd way to go about it, and luckily the applicant was happy with that, or fine with that. If we're going to have departures, then, I think it would be good to talk about, do we want departures? When would we consider that? We have to have criteria. It has to be, because we have to create predictability for an applicant to understand, and I know you know this, what is the path? How is there certainty? What is predictability for how to get through this process? So I think the question is, one, do you think departures are appropriate? Two, if so, what would they be? Would they be for everything? Would there be for certain things? And talking a little bit about the, under what circumstances, so that we can try and craft tangible criteria.
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's a tough task.
Hi.
Lucy, I appreciate
It's
it.
certainly tough, but I think it's the one way we do have to address subjective issues. Color usually being the big one. Departures allowed upon commission review and discretion. I think another thing you can always count on is designers and architects pushing the envelope. So there's going to be variation and wiggle room just within what's presented to us, I feel like. So that's one way. Or do we just say, that's a zoning issue and it has nothing to do with this. This is prescriptive. I don't know. How do you guys feel about that?
So the administrative adjustment of standards process that exists now, what, I haven't read it in a while, but what's the range of discretion that's presented through that, either to the director or to the commission?
So administrative, well, I won't go into procedures right now, but in terms of discretion, there is a list of things that may not be adjusted. So you can't add uses that are not listed. You can't go above the height. You can't go above the impervious. So there's certain things that are excluded. And then all other things are available for adjustment. There is a general list in Chapter 1 and then of criteria. And then many of the development standards, which are the more prescriptive standards, have specific criteria. So streets have a specific set of criteria. I'm blanking, parking has a specific set of criteria. The design standards tend to just rely on the general list in Chapter 1. And, I mean, I can pull that up if there's an interest in looking at that process.
Well, I was just thinking that if that would be something that could be applied to this or modified to apply to allow for some discretion, but keeping in mind, you know, the way this is written, it's in most ways written in a performance standard. It's not a black and white. There are a few, thou shalt be this, or no more than that, but there's already a significant amount of discretion in interpreting this document.
Sure.
Discretion, but it doesn't seem like there's a lot of room outside the general borders of the styles.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the styles are the styles, so that could fall to an administrative adjustment standards to apply styles or elements of styles outside the areas they're prescribed in.
Right.
But isn't that part of the function of the Development Commission, is to look at the style and see if it falls under Northwest or Craftsman? You know,
So-
that's why you bring people from different walks of life to decide, is that the style or not?
When we brought the question that the commission had raised about, you know, urban core and traditional or Issaquah area, and can they overlap? And they started talking about, you know, sort of a bit of a Chinese menu, and I said, that's like too much for staff to, you know, that's going to be very difficult to administer. So I think that we want something that it has a certain level of clarity.
So part of this is, you know, going back to chapter 1, sorry, Mr. Chair. So, or maybe it's the beginning of this chapter. So one of the things that they are proposing is 2 distinct districts, right? And the more you guys want to blend those, I mean, I think you need to go back to, does that make sense? Or do you want just one district in the whole central Issaquah? I mean, the rationale for having 2 and making a distinction for the core is saying the core should be perceptible by the rest of the community as different than the rest of central Issaquah. And that's a yes or no. That's a, we should talk about that. Is that important? Because if so, then the standards, the architecture is one of the big ways that you can do that. Make the buildings look different in the core than they do not in the core, okay? And so that's, I think that's at the premise of this. Now, I think if ultimately outside the core, if the only choice is Northwest Lodge, I think asking the consultant to say, give me another choice so that there's at least 2, because that's a choice, one is not a choice. You know, that's a different conversation. I think philosophically, what I need to hear from you guys is, does it make sense to have 2 distinct districts? And one basically being analogous to the core or the regional growth center. Should that have a different architecture, a perceived architectural style than everywhere else? And that's I think it's a very basic question that at some point, doesn't have to be now.
Good point.
At some point, you guys should talk through, because it goes to a lot of what you guys are talking about for exceptions and deviations. If you're holding a more true line, then I don't know that you want as much opportunity to say, I've got this building, it's going to look really cool, but it's maybe not going to be that regional growth center style that everybody else has just done. Because my building's better.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah. No, that's a good point, you know, and I would agree with that point. And that would, if you say just one district or one core, whatever the term may be, we would eliminate the discussion about, well, why is it drawn right here? Why isn't my property part of this or that? Just have one architectural design standard, which is this one. And if you deviate from this one, then we need to sit down and talk about it. So that's along the same line of what Keith's talking about. And I would agree, willing to listen to forming into one district rather than 2.
To allow all styles,
To be the same,
all these styles everywhere throughout.
yeah, yeah. So
But do we still want the core of the core to be distinctive?
And the one thing I'll add, because I'm just looking at the district table, as the intensity and heights are significantly different in urban core than elsewhere. So
Yeah.
if people choose to build closer to the maximum, you're going to get all Northwest Contemporary, so you're going to effectively do that. So the question is, how much do you want the builder to be making that decision based on the size of their building versus saying, this is the district and we want that district to have these edges and that character? Two valid ways to go.
That's a huge question.
Well,
about-
You're welcome.
'cause it's
Any
gonna
more bright ideas?
so,
Any more bright ideas, Keith?
so if we go back to the word that was used before, neighborhood, it seems to me that what we want to do, or what I thought the consensus was then, was that's a good idea, because that's really what this whole thing is about. It's protecting neighborhoods and allowing growth in specific areas in specific ways. So I'm a little bit leery about what's getting away from that, to put it mildly. So it makes me a little uncomfortable to think about allowing.
Allowing overlap.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let me
I
ask
mean,
you-
I think we have a
Let's ask
sense
it two ways, Randy. One would be, we've got the core, and then we've got, say, the 4 or 5 styles.
Yeah.
The traditional.
Right.
Are you uncomfortable with the core contemporary moving into the traditional? And are you uncomfortable with traditional moving into the contemporary?
I think the idea of having the central core be distinctive in terms of the height and the type of architecture is preferable to having it in having that style morph outside of it.
So you're uncomfortable with the contemporary moving into the traditional areas?
So you're advocating two zones, if you will,
Yeah.
two districts.
But how do you feel about the traditional styles moving into the core?
Well, I'm kind of ambivalent about that, because it seems to me that a developer, an applicant with the price of land these days probably wouldn't propose that to begin with, unless, I mean, it just seems to me to be not the premium use from an applicant's point of view.
But if they wanted, because I think the architect their feeling had been they didn't want traditional in the core area, if I remember their
Right,
presentation.
Yeah.
But it sounds like and I guess it's a question, would we be comfortable allowing traditional styles in the urban core? If somebody wants to do it.
Well, maybe I've just got an incorrect vision of the urban core, because I see the urban core as the higher buildings in Issaquah.
I think that's
They-
accurate.
They likely would
and-
be, but if somebody came along and said, you know what, I just want to build a really nice 4-story Northwest Lodge building right in the middle of the urban core, really what I want to do. And right now, we would say, no, you can't do that, that's not allowed
Yeah,
to put that building there.
yeah, I think that's a good idea to stick with that, to say, nope, sorry.
Okay.
I mean, to me, that's the core of what we're doing here, is
It's
saying,
Uh-huh.
nice building, but it doesn't fit. That's,
It's the core
we're
contemporary.
trying to get very clear guidelines on this. And I have another question, Lucy, on the,
Well, I'm sorry, can I back up do you mind?
no,
I guess the
no.
question for the other commissioners, since it's come up too, because I think it's a good point about this,
Yeah,
whether we bleed things over one to the other.
yeah. Go ahead.
I don't want to saw a building in half or a lot in half. I think there has
Well,
to be
not
some
that, but I think
flexibility.
you've made good points. I'd like the other commissioners' opinions.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this as well, and I still don't think I've fallen on one side of the fence or the other. I think the third element of variation we have on our side, or character, is time, right? I think we're really not going to see this take shape for maybe 20, 30 years before it's highly identifiable what we're doing here. So I think that adds the variation in character. I think part of what you hear the community wanting to preserve is character. So I guess I always become concerned that urban core will erode character. And I think the best example I can think of, just as an example, is the Top Pot donut. What would you do if that wasn't there? You know, I think I might be pretty bummed out. I mean, it's such an interesting little folly in what is otherwise pretty bland, you know. So how do you allow for that variation? What tool is there to allow for that variation? I don't know. That's an example. I'm not saying Top Pot donut or atomic or whatever that style is appropriate, but it's folly. It's identifiable. Everybody knows it. It's probably the most popular thing in that area, in my opinion. So, is what I'm saying? Do I have an answer to what I'm saying? Probably not, but I just think that's at the core of character that I think we're trying to preserve or promote or define. So, thoughts, questions, comments on that notion?
I'm probably on the side of saying that the urban core ought to be distinctive, and so the loss of Top Pot building wouldn't bother me nearly as much as losing the Top Pot donuts. And you can cook donuts anywhere, you know, so the reality is, I think that it is what we've been trying to do is in the sense of transition from Sleepy Little Issaquah to a more urban environment really is going to take 20 years, but you're going to see that transition.
Yeah.
But it sounds like you're in favor then, like with Randy, of the bright line
Absolutely.
between the districts.
But I go back to an early example we were having before the meeting even started of the fish hatchery. What a unique thing. And I think that's an identifiable landmark in this town. And so how do you bring that into the core, I guess? And maybe the answer is you don't, and that's how it goes. But I'm just posing the question is there a loss of character potentially in that core?
So, but you're just referring to two things that currently exist. So the idea here is can we create new, interesting and unique features or buildings in the city? And so I'm in the camp of kind of trying to create this kind of identifiable city center, essentially core, the urban core piece. I think that makes sense to me, and I think the dimensions of that are allowed there, and Randy's point about people are going to be pushing to maximize their development on their property just because property values are high. I think it's going to drive a lot of that. That being said, I think there needs to be some way where there is a unique development idea to actually get consideration, so we can look at creating a new and unique feature in the city, because we don't want, the idea of character is important. We don't want everything to be, you know, this kind of vertical, more edgy, kind of urban, and that's all you get. You want to have things that are the identifiable character of the city, or something that's an attractive feature that people talk about. It's the memorable elements. And some of these buildings, you know, if you put a bunch of them together, it's not going to be a memorable element. It's just going to be a lot of buildings that are somewhat similar in style. But it's how do we do that? And so I think that's something that we need to think about, a pathway for those kind of unique ideas that might emerge that we really want to think about.
So
wonder if
I'll
we're-
give you a preview of the next chapter, which they have, you know, it's vocabulary's all disappearing at this hour. They're discouraging look at me buildings, except civic buildings, which, you know, Vancouver, British Columbia is considered sort of a classic example of background buildings, except then there's some that aren't background buildings. You know, the law courts, UBC, there's some really fabulous and distinctive buildings. I don't mean to derail us, but I do think that they are thinking that every building doesn't need to stand out. Some buildings should stand out. I think civic buildings could be a good example. If we don't have any civic buildings in central Issaquah, does that mean every building is a background building? Discuss.
If you don't mind, I'm curious too what other commissioners think about the bright line concept, urban,
yeah.
contemporary versus.
I'm willing to listen to see, Lucy, they have to do this, all this work. What would that mean if we were just to combine the whole, the urban core and then traditional? There's obviously some work that needs to be done to it, but I'm more into maybe having one core rather than two separate ones. And, you know, you look at the map and you have this little chunk that's sticking out from the urban core, and I don't understand what that is, but, you know, you get a situation.
This here?
Yeah, it's like an appendix that,
I think it's, I think it follows the zoning line.
yeah.
Up at the top there, is that Western Gateway out there?
So this area is the one that is the question, because you're right, that.
East Lake.
Well, it's part of the mixed-use zone. You're talking the neighborhood. I'm looking at the zoning map. I just don't have that well, maybe I have.
So that's East Lake. Western Gateway's where it says, you could actually see Gateway on the map
Small font,
underneath.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So that's Western Gateway.
Yeah.
I think the appendix is part of either Pickering or Darst. I can't remember which neighborhood that is.
Well, there is a, it's kind of because of the way the creek flows, I think, but.
Yeah. But we would get away from this, where's the line drawn, and just eliminate discussion, and then it makes it easier for the staff and for the folks reviewing that this is the core, whatever the name is at that time. So here's the standard that you need to follow.
Well, I guess the question would be, let's keep going around though, because that's one idea. So Ray, you're in favor, it sounds like, of eliminating the distinctions between the two. It would all be one.
Just one.
And Randy's brought up the idea of keeping the bright line between urban contemporary and all the others. Richard, I think you're in favor of keeping the bright line.
I had posed one going one way but not the other. The urban, the Northwest Contemporary never finds itself in traditional, but traditional can find its way into
Okay.
urban core, mostly for those virtues I was talking about, just of how do you build character or preserve or.
Okay, Ryan,
I prefer to have the distinction of the neighborhoods.
between the two, okay. Richard?
Well, I was just ready to change my vote from last time when I like traditional allowing to migrate inside urban core. I think I'm for more of a distinction for urban core now. And the reason is the way the Northwest Contemporary has been developed in this draft of the manual. I'm seeing a lot more things in there now than I saw before, including residential uses. But I'm not at all opposed to the exact opposite of what Kevin said. The contemporary moving outside of that, especially when I look at traditional Issaquah up there in Gateway only. And if we're to achieve densities up there, we might want to allow more than one style, although I understand there might be other approaches to that. I think there are other areas here in the traditional area, Issaquah zone over to the right where Northwest Contemporary could be appropriate in some uses. So I'm not opposed to Northwest Contemporary moving out, but exactly the opposite, I guess, of Commissioner Price, who's the architect, so I should be quiet now.
How's that for clear direction, sir?
Yes.
Well, so here's something to think about, and this just struck me thinking about what you're saying, Commissioner Sanford. Northwest Contemporary may be the most comfortable for architects. And so I think one thing you risk by allowing Northwest Contemporary into the traditional Issaquah area is it may be the default architectural style because it will be the most familiar and comfortable, and it is kind of where the market is right now. And so I think if your goal is to have distinction between the two areas, and maybe a softer edge, I wouldn't try and achieve that by allowing the Northwest Contemporary outside of that area.
I agree.
Mr. Brennan? Bright line?
Already answered this.
You said bright line?
Yeah, I'm in for the bright line, but I guess my point was creating an opportunity for, where appropriate, unique project or architecture or civic building or something that could apply a different architectural standard within the core.
So if that is a sentiment of the commission, I think one thing we could task the consultants with is, could they maybe expand that net a little bit for what becomes a kind of a instead of just civic buildings, because I'm not sure the city's got the resources to build a bunch of buildings in central Issaquah, but not even over the next 30 years. But, you know, could there be other prominent buildings, and maybe we need to figure out how we could describe those so that they can come in and say, hey, we are one of these, and that's why our architecture is going to be a kind of a deviation off of what the standards say. And I don't know if that's possible. I don't know what that would look like, but if that's something the commission as a whole say, yeah, let's explore that, we can always kick that question to them, see what they come up with, and when it comes back, we just may throw it against the wall and say, well, we don't like it. Let's leave it the way it is. Don't know.
And I think I would agree with Mr. Price about the allowing the bright line, but allowing if somebody wants to bring in a traditional building into the core, they want to build a 3-story building and they can do it with the minimum FAR and make it fit in a craftsman style, I would be okay with that. But the bigger concern I have in the bright line would get back to the limitations, because on the map up here in our zoning map, all that purple is mixed use, which you can go up to 85 feet with. And I think you get there in large part maybe with affordable housing and some other things. And if we want to encourage affordable housing, if we want it in the purple areas, in those areas, if we take that one portion out of the urban core, if those are in these restrictions, the only thing that could go to 85 feet would be Northwest Lodge. And I have a hard time thinking, we say, yes, we want an affordable housing project, now build it in this Northwest Lodge style, and
So,
it's too limiting.
as Keith indicated, there's a lot of moving pieces around through the moratorium. So a housing strategy is part of that, and affordable housing is a big discussion topic. So I wouldn't want you deciding architectural styles to try and get affordable housing.
Oh,
So-
right.
So
No, yeah.
that's my only point. I think if you, if you want to have more variety of buildings that are available in a district that maybe has ways to get more height, then I think that's the question.
Yeah.
I don't want you to try and solve affordable
No,
housing.
exactly. I was just saying as a kind of a side note that
Yes.
we may be going against one of the city's wishes if we limit those buildings.
Question, Mr. Chairman. Lucy, maybe you can answer this. On the west side of the urban core, there's that traditional Issaquah. Do you know the purpose of that little thing that's sticking up there?
You mean, why is this
Yeah,
area?
why do we have that as a traditional and not just lump it into urban core or some?
Well,
yeah,
it's,
seems-
that's out where Gateway and Riva and a lot of the other projects that you've looked at, it's
Yeah, no.
probably.
It's outside the urban core zoning.
Yeah.
But the properties over there are all spoken for, isn't it?
Well, not quite all of them.
Yeah, there's a few ones out there, but not a whole lot, but to pull that out, well, not pull that out, but to designate that as traditional Issaquah all by itself out there seems different, interestingly different. So you don't know the purpose of that then, huh?
Well, I think generally, what Commissioner Morgan said is correct, that the urban core generally follows the urban core zone, and that area is not zoned. It's,
It's lower density, lower height buildings.
thank you.
Less intense. So those other styles seem to fit better. Architectural styles seem to fit better out there.
Thank you.
Have people go through the document with,
Pardon me?
want to go through the document with comments?
I was going to, are there other questions in the architect, in chapter 2?
I actually, Lucy, if you would go back to the administrative adjustment of standards thing, because we've been talking about how do we allow somebody with a really good design to do something that is not exactly in compliance with the districting. I mean, that's come up a couple of times. And I actually have to apologize publicly because I haven't looked at this in a long time. No, that's the one that was up there before had a list of things like that, but it was about how, yeah, there we go. When I just looked at that quickly when it was up there, it seems to me that an AAS, if you really look at that, there's almost everything is open to an AAS if it's in the code. So critical areas except as authorized by the code. So above the sentences, no administrative adjustment may be made for standards or requirements listed below, except as otherwise permitted by this code. And if you look at A through K, the way I'm understanding the wording there is just about everything you can ask for an AAS.
I think that the wording may be misleading. So I think what that means is that in critical areas, for instance, it will say you can buffer average if you do it in this particular way. So that might be considered an adjustment of the standards, but it is a very prescribed adjustment, whereas an adjustment of standards is just asking to do something differently because you feel you can meet the objectives a different way. You couldn't come in and say, my proposal is to build a house on a critical area because I think I can do it in a way that will meet the intent. We would say no. We wouldn't be able to adjust that because critical areas is listed in here.
Okay, I understand what you're saying there. It just seems the wording of that flat declarative sentence followed by how many A through K. However, you can get an AAS if it's in the code. It seems almost contradictory, and that's, I think, one of the concerns that I've had in these meetings is that we routinely run into AASs, and I understand it's completely legal, I get it, and it's very carefully analyzed, but it just seems to me that it's a matter of routine that we get a request for an AAS on pervious surface or buffers or things like that, when if you just read that first sentence, it would be very clear. You know what I'm saying? If people look at that, well, if I did, and I'm not sure there's an I can't come up with a suggestion for, and I know we're not supposed to be wordsmithing this, but that's a pretty fundamental aspect of how we do this.
This is not part of what we're discussing.
I know, but we're talking, would this not be a mechanism for getting into the
What we were
doing
talking.
architectural style in a district that it's not?
I think that's zoning, and this is style.
So I think to get back to the point that Commissioner Brennan was identifying, this says anything that isn't in this chapter, meaning the design manual takes precedent over Central Issaquah.
This is what we're doing here.
Right. So this piece of code that you're looking at the screen, or this down here, is in the Central Issaquah standards. If that isn't referenced in the design manual, you don't get to use these tools.
Okay.
So if we wanted to, and I'm not suggesting, but if there was some form of departure, or if these criteria were the criteria you wanted to use, then you could say in the design manual, we allowed, adjustments of these standards for roof pitch, I'm making that up, for roof pitch using the criteria that are in Chapter 1 of the Central Issaquah standards.
Thank you.
So, other questions? Okay, I'm concerned about the time. We're scheduled to go till 9 o'clock. We have 2 members of the public, and what might seem appropriate at this point is if they wish to make comment, I would like to open up the opportunity for the public to provide comment, and would ask you to sign in. We'll give you 5 minutes each.
My name's Connie Marsh, and I live up on Squawk Mountain. So from my community standpoint, this conversation is about how do we create an Issaquah that we recognize and is even better than the Issaquah that we have now while accepting density. When we create a bright line with an urban center, I cannot disagree that we are going to lose what Issaquah was, because that is never what Issaquah was. These guidelines or these architectural standards create a new sort of Issaquah form. So to my mind, the question is whether that form would fit in with what you would see Issaquah would be larger, so as an extent of Issaquah. So if you are looking at an old town with large bank buildings, because we have lots of small towns in our area that have bigger buildings, are those the styles of buildings that we would be expecting to get in our core that would create that area? There's no glass shown. There's none of the Bellevue Eastgate style buildings there. So we need to be very sure that we don't want to push into the future to that look to some extent, because if we go with this, we are going to be in sort of this old school for the rest of, until we change the code again, right? So I wouldn't make exceptions, because then you never know where you're going, but I might allow for a little more variation in styles of building as a part of the package. And so that's just a beginning, and I'm going to go through my notes really fast because I only have 5 minutes. This presentation of the manual needs a numbering system so you can actually orient yourself and discuss it without having to say at the bottom of which page and what kind of page is that. And some things were lost that to me seem to be integral in architecture. And those are the uses of the buildings, like weather protection. What does that look like? Some of the buildings talked about the glass not being opaque, but that sort of was in the central urban section, yet even though we're going to have shopping in the outlying areas, it didn't discuss anything about sort of the pedestrian interface with the lower stories of the buildings. And I found that concerning, because we're going to be using the shorter buildings in the same ways, and the pedestrian is of major concern. And I don't know if that's coming into the future, but it felt like those were missing. And then there's the discussion of situational placement, which it actually calls out situational placement, and it's like, well, does the building fit here? What are the criteria for those, and what might that be? Do we want a lot of buildings that look the same, going cookie cutter, cookie cutter, cookie cutter? What kind of variation would you want to see in a particular neighborhood, right? So that you would know where you were. And I didn't see that fleshed out enough that you all would be able to make a decision, is it appropriately situational when you're looking at it and reviewing the project? Because you might say, wow, we have 16 of those buildings and I can't stand to look at them ever again, but we have no way to say no to that building. Discussion of the interface with landscaping. We have architectural standards that we can use with landscaping. Again, it's the pedestrian feel and the use of the building and how your entrances to the building all fit together. And this is just the facade sort of a thing. And that doesn't seem like enough. And I'm not sure if that's coming later. And I saw that yawn, so I'll go louder and faster. The concept of Northwest Contemporary. And I have a hard time with that because I picture Northwest Contemporary like the library building on Front and Sunset. And we could have that building in traditional Issaquah. Yet we are not providing the forms for that in this situation. So, and then I have some details on I don't understand what the varying, like Lucy said, articulation means. And it's not addressed in the pictures as the examples, so there needs to be some coherence between the language and the pictures so that you know exactly what they're talking about. Because I was confused by what they intended between the language and the pictures. Colors you guys hit upon needs work. So, okay, this is my favorite. There's lots of pictures of buildings where I want to be a sheep herder and then go in for a pint. And I'm not really sure that Issaquah is a sheep herding town. And so I might kick out a couple of those building styles and get something a little less English or Irish Moor, so to speak. And I already talked about the, oh, there we go. Talked about the library building. I want those in there so I don't have to get on my horse and load my shotgun. Thank you. What? It was a long day. But I woke you up.
Don't forget to sign in.
Oh.
It's a tough crowd.
Yeah, Mary Lynch, 2690 Northwest Oakcrest, and I'll sign in. Just to further say, I already commented about the lower part of the urban core and that the community meetings, that the community really wanted it moved up to Juniper. Because they wanted to keep the other residential. So if you look here, I think it is still included. The other concern I have as part of this is an action task force for the Central Area Plan. We saw Home Depot and Fred Meyer's and all are things that could go higher and have mixed use. This is not included in the urban core. This would be traditional. So what you have over now, if it is to be redeveloped, anything with Fred Meyer's or Home Depot would go back not to what we have. And what we saw is, since that's up against the mountain, that is a good place, and since it's near a major road, those are areas that could go higher and provide mixed use with housing and all above it. So I would say you need to relook at some of your urban, if you're going to keep these designations, you need to look at where those boundaries are and have them fit more closely with what the district visions were and where I think from those meetings what the public said they wanted them to be, and go back and work with Trish and all to make sure that those are incorporated similarly. And I really do think as far as uses, you need to talk about urban schools and other things that are going to be located down here so that those reflect in the architectural standards. And the other thing, I did kind of allude to it, is the rooftops. When you have a big building and you're going to be looking down on your rooftops, I think we need to do a better job of having green roofs and also protecting some of the utilities that are on top of the buildings from the views and the view corridors that are above them. Thank you.
Don't forget to sign in. Thank you. So,
We get paid that way. The number of folks that sign.
we've asked questions. How about thoughts in general over the construction of the document to this point?
I think there's a lot of work that went into this, and I really appreciate the effort that really went into it. We're in a bit of a crunch here. You know, you try to have some tools for the folks in the city to do their job, and at the same time, for us to have some kind of a guidance when we say yes or no to a certain project. But I think the moratorium is it's in place, and I think we need to move a little bit faster on this. That's my thought on this, but overall, I think we're headed the right direction. Thank you, Lucy, and your staff. And Keith, too. Thank you.
I'd like to bring up, I think Mary brought up a good point about the Home Depot, Fred Meyer, that area, because it got me to page 26 of 75, in talking about the architectural districts or zones. And that second paragraph right there in the middle, traditional Issaquah areas primarily composed of residential neighborhoods, reflect more traditional architectural styles. And I was thinking, well, that's not really true of most of that stuff along East Lake Sammamish there. And it does make me wonder about, is it, again, maybe this gets back to some of these traditional styles being too limiting, is we would then be saying we're gonna go back to the Irish pubs and the traditional things that, the buildings being built along here in an 85-foot zone. So even just that paragraph, that discussion I brought up, I thought that needed some change. And it does bring up my question about, could contemporary work somewhere else? Or do we need another style that can work in an area like that?
Mr. Chair, I am very happy with the process. I am very happy with the pace. I think we need to take as much time as we need to take to get it right. And I think we're doing that as far as I'm concerned. I think the pace and the inclusion is right on the money. And I'm very proud of this process. And I am also, I really like the product. So process, pace, and product, as far as I'm concerned, we're proceeding in the right direction at the right pace.
I've got another comment, if you don't mind. I'll just keep popping them in here. So, on page 29 of 75, the Urban Core Contemporary, a couple things. At the top there, the goal is to encourage consistency, unity, and timelessness. And I don't know that I feel that that would be the goal of the architectural style I would want to have in the urban core, for everything to be consistent and uniform. And then the first line of simple composition with vertical emphasis, again, I don't know, it sounds to me like it could be a fairly dull urban center is what they're looking for. And I know their opinion was it seemed to be more if they wanted the street side things to be interesting and the buildings to be plain. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. And I didn't see anything in the discussion here, their description that actually talked about northwest, something that made it feel northwest other than maybe durable materials. And I didn't see a discussion of balconies in there that I think are important, getting back to the central Issaquah plan and the buildings we saw in there in the core that show lots of balconies. And then personally, I was not impressed with any three of these buildings. I wouldn't want to see maybe the first one. The bottom one, I don't know, I thought that might have been built in East Berlin or something.
Same comment on that. Is that the best we want to show as an example?
Yeah, that's not what I would look for in.
I do too. But that's why we're here listening to you.
Yeah, I thought that, yeah, that's not at all. The second one, the middle one, to me, maybe, sort of works. But then the first one, it kind of looks like an insane asylum.
It's
I'm sorry.
contemporary 1930s.
I hope the architect's not here, sorry.
There will be no sheep herders.
Mr. Chair, I would like to jump in, though, and on the point about the northern part of the traditional Issaquah zone, I completely agree with that. That I have not really understood that designation or why it's carved out and in the traditional Issaquah. It seems to me, based on what it is now, and the potential for redevelopment, that it should be urban core.
So are you talking about this area or out
Yeah,
here?
right
where-
there, yeah.
Where Fred Meyer
Yeah.
and, yeah, okay.
And I would say either urban core or something different than,
Or different
a
classification.
different classification than just these buildings, yeah.
Good.
So we're back to urban core images and you know, I guess I appreciate your concern that you don't want, okay, these may not be the right images. I think the only thing I would say about these three images is they don't look alike. Okay, so if.
So they're not consistent, right?
So well.
Sorry.
We're having fun. But I guess so I get, you know, what is consistent and what is variety? So, And so I understand your concern, and I think that the important, I think from what I've gathered, we would all say we don't want something that feels monotonous. And I would say that even if we don't like these three images, if all of these fit into Northwest Contemporary, that isn't very monotonous. So I think that is a good sign. But we still need to get images that we would be, of things that we think are things that we would want to see, because by not liking some of these images, that helps elucidate maybe things that, characteristics of Northwest Contemporary we would want to incorporate.
Okay, on that same line, page 68 of 75, down at the bottom. I think we did like this image in a previous meeting, 68 of 75.
Sorry.
There,
This
on
one?
the right, yes.
Yes, that one you did like a lot.
Do we like that image a lot?
Do you
Always
still like
reminds
it?
me of Queens, New York. Okay.
I wrote a note here, I did not like the image at the top.
You all were very clear about that, and I had
Okay.
communicated that to them, that
Okay.
that there was a different townhouse product, that image that they had used, which you had liked. And I recommended that they change it out for this one, because I remembered that was not a fan favorite.
This one.
The top
Yeah,
one.
yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
One other, page 71 of
I'm
75.
sorry, before we
Sorry,
leave
go
that
ahead.
page, though, just, and this is where I think just an edit sort of, if taller than 4 to 5 floors, where it talks about appropriate. That third sentence, if taller than 4 to 5 floors. And
Yep.
again, that, to me, you can't give developer that, it's one or the other.
Okay.
Yeah, pick one. Thank you.
Sure, just one other question on page 71 of 75. The two middle pictures, is that picture on the left a picture of a door or a picture window?
Well, what it says is it's a sliding glass door, open and closed. Yeah, it looks like a window to me, but I'm looking at a little blurry picture on a monitor.
Yeah, the
Those are
one on the
two-
left
those are
looks
two
like
different-
you would walk into a desk, I think, there.
It looks pretty windowish.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
one is
think-
closed and one
Okay.
is open.
I think they have two different pictures.
Yeah, they're two different. I think it's the door on the right, but on the left, I think it's probably a picture window.
Yeah, but the parenthesis
Yeah.
is one is closed.
Okay.
I had a question, page 67, under Northwest Contemporary, under description, sloped roofs shall only be used for residential buildings, and minimal to no overhang or eaves. And I guess I wondered why. Seems to me, I don't know why we would prevent commercial buildings from having a sloped roof to them. Because I think there are a lot of, I've seen very nice sloped roofs at the tops of buildings. What was the WAMU Center downtown, or the original one or whatever, that I think it's a mechanical area, but.
46 stories tall.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, it's a commercial building that's got a sloped roof at the top, and I think it can look good. And I don't see why it has to be, why you can't have a commercial with. And since we're close, page 66, for appropriate color, to prevent kind of thing we went through a couple decades ago where traditional barn red, maybe in parentheses, we can say, just specify Pickering barn red. I don't know, people may not have been here when we went through the painting of Pickering and what barn red was supposed to be, and had meetings with,
Wow.
yeah, to go over what that was, so.
I've heard.
Let's not do that again.
Let's not do that again. We have an example, Pickering barn red.
I had a question about black on the same page. Appropriate neutrals, black. Would we think that a stark black, a pure black would be appropriate for a wall color?
Well, it depends. Depends on how much wall there is. If you could have a lot of windows and glass, and black might work.
Okay.
Yeah. Depends how you trim it out, so.
Okay, so pure black is fine.
I'd say yes.
Okay.
There's a recent remodel down on Front Street where they basically took out a nail salon and put in an office space. It's for Madison Development. It's black. So next time you stroll down Front Street, just kind of take a look at it and see how it feels. I actually think it looks really classy.
It's 20 feet wide, though.
Not big.
Page 58 of 75, I guess we're going to get content on that page, right? They just haven't completed that yet.
I think they get paid by the page, they just slip one in there for an extra bonus.
No, actually, I don't think you're going to get any content on that one. I'm serious. I think that the way they've approached it is that there's one page for each of these topics. And I think what they're saying is that the roof isn't going to be visible in Western Falls Front, so they're not going to specify it.
Makes sense. Yes.
That's, but I mean, that was my read of it.
Me too.
Lucy, page 64, 75, on the urban grain style for doors. I thought it'd be helpful to add garage-style doors with glass that will open up to expand the space out.
So I think, are you saying you want that added?
I'd like that added.
Isn't that, so
Isn't that
help me understand with the words. I
overhead
thought that
garage
the
door?
glass
Oh.
overhead garage door would
Oh, there- I
cover, would
missed
that
that.
cover
Sorry.
it?
Right, yeah.
No, I just want to make sure.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's a sliding and farmhouse.
You're thinking about the pub, right?
Exactly. That's right. Open that brew pub up.
So other comments, general?
Actually, I thought on page 46 of 75, it was interesting to me looking at these buildings on the Northwest Lodge style because the number 1 and 2 are good and 3 is inappropriate. And I looked at those, and number 2, I'm not sure if that's like Claylock Lodge or something, but Crescent Lake. And I look at that, and to me, it does look like a building that would be out somewhere in a forest like that, in a very large roof. To me, I thought that was a lot of roof cover to be looking at in a building, say in Issaquah. And then I look at the bottom one, and I think maybe that's a more, I think it was the vertical emphasis and a couple of things on the bottom one that they didn't like, but actually, I thought that might be a more interesting building for Northwest Lodge style today.
I agree, yeah.
Not a 100-year-old lodge.
We don't like the ones they picked, and we like the one they we're not supposed to like.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah, I
should be
think
the other
so.
way around.
And what other people think about it, but,
I agree.
I had the same feeling. Is it possible, Lucy, to ask, to me, it seemed it would be helpful in the long run if if more of the pictures were actually Issaquah buildings? Because I think we've got some really good examples of all of these, maybe not a lot of them, but I do think we've got examples in Issaquah of Grange style, of all these. And it just seems to me to be a good idea, rather than showing Crescent Lake, if we had at least one of the pictures that was an extant structure in Issaquah. I don't know how others feel about that, but.
Sort of Northwest Lodge style.
Well, or in arts and crafts, or,
Yeah.
but particularly in contemporary. Well, I don't know if we can, I don't know if we have one that we want to put in there, but if we do have, it just seems to me to be a great idea to say, we're looking for, this is already here, this is what we're looking for in this style.
Well, and
So-
as Connie mentioned, I think I'd love to have the picture of the library somewhere in here and to see where it could fit. I'm not sure it does in these categories, but.
Well, and I agree. And I'll tell you just from and I don't know about other designers on the commission, it was illuminating to me, because a lot of the examples that we use in our guidelines are buildings we know. Now, staff in development services are from lots of different places, so we have lots of pictures from different places, and so they may not be places that the designers who are having to pick this up and use it may know. And it was illuminating to me to pick up a document and not know a lot of the pictures that are in here, in a bad way, because I want to walk around a building, I want to sort of see what it feels like and how to experience those things. And it would be nice to have some examples that, we can say to a designer, go look at this building, as opposed to just looking at a little, even knowing where it is so you can look at Google Street View.
Yeah, and I would say, we don't need to put an Issaquah example as an inappropriate. I'm not suggesting that, but if one of the pictures out of the three, if we could do that, would be an Issaquah structure for exactly that reason, I think it's desirable.
Okay.
Also on page 38 of 75, on the arts and crafts style, talking about color, warm white, gray, tan, olive, and that was it. And maybe that's, I don't know, maybe that's true of the arts and crafts style, but it seemed like a pretty limited color palette to say you can be white or gray or olive or tan.
I would agree. I would also make allowances for dark brown.
What about dark gray?
Isn't dark
And
brown
dark
just
gray, just dark, in general.
Other specific comments?
More comments? Good job. General comments?
Just a couple quick general comments about progress here. I think we're creating a tool I think is going to be really useful. And it's not going to be perfect when it's done. And it can evolve as we have experience with it. So going for perfection and contemplating every what if is probably not productive. But I will say, this discussion tonight, hopefully it's been helpful to staff and the consultants to continue to refine it so that it's a more useful tool for us, because we're, along with staff, are going to be primary users of this from an implementation standpoint, along with all the design professionals and others that are going to use it. But it's going to be important for us. I think that's good. And just another comment, I know this is a huge amount of work for staff, and you have a huge pile of stuff in front of you, and I appreciate the you know, the attention that you've been giving to the comments that we've been providing, and a lot of credit and kudos to staff for your efforts on this. I appreciate that.
Thanks.
Agreed.
Comments. Have we addressed the, and I don't see it here, the issue with roofing, you know, solar equipment that goes on the roof? We talk about different asphalt, you know, with shingles, you can use this, you can't use that. But looking ahead, there's a lot of solar power industry that's coming into play. And how's that incorporated in here? Maybe I shouldn't just limit it to solar power, but there are other equipment that, are we allowing that to go in there, into the traditional Issaquah area?
Well, I don't think the intent isn't to have it, but I think it's a great question. How does it fit in with the architectural styles? Are there specific recommendations or techniques that are necessary to make those, if you're going to be adding something like solar, how you would do it?
Yeah, so if I'm a developer, I come in and I say, I have this new building, and whatever the roof situation is, I'm putting all solar panels in there, and people look at it and says, well, it's not on here, there's no solar panels, and you're not gonna put any solar panel on there.
It can be solar panels as long as they're made out of asphalt shingles.
Well,
Yeah, is that-
actually, that's the new
That's right.
solar roof, so,
Yeah.
is
And that would be a
solar
question.
tiles.
That'd be a question.
Yeah.
So like
It's
if,
a good
yeah,
it's an
Musk is
excellent question.
able to do that and create those, how quickly can we change this? Just change something that just says asphalt
Mm-hmm,
shingles to solar shingles, or,
mm-hmm.
I mean, does
Well-
this take a long process?
Has to go through PPC and council.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
but would that not be concurrent or congruent with the development of the technology, though? Because my understanding is that that's exactly where there are prototypes right now that will be roofing materials of various appearances that will be solar panels. So that, as the technology develops, the city ought to be able to go before the PPC and say, hey, we want to adjust the standards to allow an applicant to do something, to use this new technology.
Yeah, yeah. And along the line, you know, when we start limiting the designer to what's appropriate and what is not, you know, I think we need to remember that you don't want to tie their hands too much. There's a lot of solar tiles that are coming in, solar roof tile are coming in too, and, you know, if we want to look ahead, something that we need to think about.
Final comments?
So if you have small edits or things that you think about later, please feel free to email me.
All right. So I think it's a good time to adjourn. Thanks for your staff work. Did a
Yeah.
great job. It's
So
good.
as I said, the next, I just saw that that's come in, so that'll go out tomorrow. So you should get it electronically tomorrow, paper copy next day or two. We're meeting next Wednesday. Tuesday is the council 1.5-hour work session with other topics. This is the third topic of a 3-topic meeting on this as well. So in case you want 2 nights in a row, please feel free to join us.
We're not getting enough summer school.
No extra charge. Thank you, Lucy.
That's really cool.